It is a disparity for sure, an uncomfortable one for many, and yet this gap seems to keep on widening. Joining me is Peter Schiff, president of Euro-Pacific Capital. You know, Peter, inequality in America, this is nothing new, but we just saw a report with some interesting comparisons. Federal workers making $100,000 on average versus private sector employees making just over $60,000. I mean, it's not just Wall Street versus Main Street. Now it's Washington versus Main Street. What is this about?
Well, unfortunately, Washington and Wall Street are combining to bleed Main Street dry. You know, are you okay there? Because all the wealth that is being sucked out of the private sector and the productive part of our economy is being redirected to Washington, D.C. I mean, Washington is like a giant parasite feeding off the American economy. And the bigger the parasite grows, the weaker the underlying economy becomes.
Let's talk about one of the most American things there is, home ownership. Last year, some record-breaking numbers, but not of the good kind. Home foreclosures and home repossessions, 1 million, according to Realty Track. And next year, analysts predict the number of home repossessions will actually go up to 1.2 million. What do these numbers say? What is this story that they're telling?
Well, first of all, it would have been a lot worse if we didn't have a big slowdown at the end of the year because of the scandal related to some of the robo-signing of the foreclosure process. So you had a lot of moratoriums. But the foreclosure process is going to get a lot worse because, first of all, Americans have no equity. A lot of Americans have negative equity in their homes. So there's very little incentive to make the payments, especially if you've lost your job. And unfortunately, as Washington continues to grow and suck resources out of the economy, more people are going to lose their jobs in the private sector. And, you know, it used to be that if you worked for government, you made less. You were a civil servant. You gave up a high income for the security of a government job and to do good, to be a public servant. Now, because of the raises that they get every single year, now they're our masters. They're making twice. Government workers are making twice what workers are making in the private sector. And now people aspire to Washington. And if you look at the three richest suburbs in the United States, all three of them are right outside of Washington, D.C. And in the last 10 years, Washington, D.C., that metropolitan area, gained population. It was the first decade since the 1940s where that was true.
Certainly, and we can't forget, too, about, you know, teachers and police officers. They're not all making those six-figure salaries, but certainly it is an interesting disparity. Now, let's switch now.
But they make big benefits, though. You have to include the benefit packages, their health care, their retirement benefits. When you put that into their salary, they're making a lot of money.
Point taken, for sure. I want to move on to some of the bigger companies, some of those Wall Street companies. J.P. Morgan. Analysts predicted fourth quarter profits at J.P. Morgan would hit about just a little wee $3.9 billion. Well, guess what? J.P. Morgan actually exceeded expectations and raked in $4.8 billion in profits. How are these big banks able to pull in so much when so many other people can barely even hold on?
Well, part of the reason that J.P. Morgan is making so much money is that they're taking the capital that would have gone to the private sector to more productive areas, and it's being redirected to Wall Street via the Fed. J.P. Morgan is making a lot of money by getting cheap money from the Federal Reserve and then speculating with it. So they're not creating any wealth. It's not producing employment opportunities for American people. It's just producing big profits for the executives on Wall Street, but at the expense of everybody on Main Street.
We should also mention we saw a spike in the consumer price index, a lot of kind of confusing numbers being thrown at us. I guess I want to get your take on what people should expect in the coming, let's say, quarter.
Much higher consumer prices. And, you know, they're blaming, right now food prices are at record highs. And, of course, the governments are blaming it on the weather. And, you know, you guys in Russia, you remember that, you know, every time there was a bad harvest, the old Soviet Union would blame it on the weather, on a drought. It was like there was a drought every year in what used to be the breadbasket of Europe. Well, commodity prices aren't rising because of the weather. They're rising because the money supply is exploding. They're rising because central banks around the world are creating inflation. They're debasing money. And as a result, prices rise. And prices are going to rise a lot faster in this country next year than last year. The government will try to pretend that inflation isn't a problem so they can keep creating more of it. but inflation is a huge problem, and it's going to get worse next year.
Certainly has to be tough for folks who don't see any increase in their paychecks. A lot of them seeing decreases, and yet they go to the store, they go to the gas pump, and they're spending so much more. Another question for you. I guess, you know, there's a lot of criticism of Wall Street, of these big banks. JP Morgan, we just mentioned, not only this record or this huge profit, but they're shelling out these bonuses like there's no tomorrow. What do you think the responsibility is? Do these banks have any responsibility at all?
There'd be no bonuses if we had let them fail. JP Morgan wouldn't even be in business today if they hadn't been bailed out. And the reason they're able to speculate the way they are and make all this money is because they know that they're going to get bailed out again. So they're able to take all sorts of risk with taxpayer money and lavish the short-term benefits on themselves. This is an insidious process that needs to come to an end.
You think, Peter, that you're saying that they could get bailed out again if they needed it? You really think the American people would stand for that this time around?
Look, you know, the government is already saying what a success the last round of bailouts were. They're preparing us to do it all over again.
Certainly, I hope that we don't see that. Peter Schiff, president of Euro-Pacific Capital.